Hello everyone, today we come back on 13th century Western warfare, and more specifically we will be discussing the effigy of Worcestershire, dated to roughly the first half of the 13th century. Some say around 1225, others 1250, which is preserved at Malvern Abbey. mm, the and This is a very interesting effigy. First of all, because it's one of the first actually representations of the so-called martel de fer, which is this weapon that you can see here. Even though I'm not sure it's really the first time this is depicted, it's mostly a problem of dating, because indeed there are other representations of this, but we don't know exactly when we can date, but it's still one of the earliest um, representations. It's a fairly well preserved piece of art, as quite detailed as we can see. But it's mostly interesting for this combination of the martel de fer. Martel de fer in French, meaning practically um, uh, um, iron hammer. It's a kind of weapon that we will discuss now in a while, but what it's mostly interesting is the pair of the martel de fer with this round shield. It's substantially a small buckler or targe, as you wanna call it. We're talking here around 18 inches of diameter. And this is a very interesting combination. We will explain why. On the base of an otherwise pretty average first half of the 13th century Western knight. You notice here also the scabbard, so the guy is also wearing a sword at his hanging at his belt. Let's really look at what it is really. The This hand axe, which is the martel de fer, is a pretty good indicator, as other trauma blunt weapons of in general in all warfare of a usage particularly aimed at hitting against armored opponents. When you see a mace or a hammer or something that is meant to inflict as a weapon a very energetic blunt. Wait a second, I'm searching here. The objective is to smash essentially against armor. Not much because it can pierce, as the martel de fer actually could do the armor, but much for transferring the energy of this weapon um, violently underneath the armor and inflicting internal trauma that could, even maybe without spilling blood on the outside, could cause an internal hemorrhage and therefore seriously injuring or even killing the opponent. This is interesting because the martel de fer, as you see here, has actually 2 points, 2 ends at the mace proper. It has practically sort of an axe or a chisel-like blade in the front. Here you see it in the left part, and a point at the back. So the obvious use of this is inflicting a preferably damage against armor with the front, and against, let's say, less armored parts with the back. For physical reasons that I'm not gonna discuss now, essentially if you have a mace, an axe with a squared pointy pointy end and a squared section, well, the squared section makes it extremely more effective against armor. This is what you see many times, not just with blunt weapons as such, but for instance with projectiles. If you take certain arrow points where that were present in various kind according to the kind of target they had to impact in, you see that one used against armor were squared, although I should point out that armor at this time, and essentially up to the modern age, the one worn on the battlefield was practically effective to stop almost every kind of projectile. So even the idea of an arrow striking, for instance, into a plate armor is kind of I lack evidence of that. While with mail, like you see here, this guy is wearing, could definitely be pierced even by arrows, but only with a practical effect if it was a very powerful shot at close range, if it was a bow, if it was a crossbow at longer range. The reason being, and not being absolutely infrequent at this time, that the padded linen that existed that was worn underneath the mail, and it was worn for many reasons, including protection, but also for warming up, for keeping the body isolated from heat or cold in the outside. With cotton is pretty good at that. But also not just to make the naked skin, rubbing against metal that is pretty uncomfortable and can cause damage as well. Well, the arrows could even pierce through the mail, but they would usually stop, or likely stop in the and get stuck into the mail, but not making it through underneath the padded coat. And a reason for which you could see at this time knights really looking with like a pink cushion essentially, and still fighting because the point of the arrow had remained struck into their armor, but hadn't hit underneath, or maybe had caused a light wound, just a light wound. With crossbow, things start to change, and in fact, the spreading of a crossbow, and especially the progressive strengthening of their force, brought the mid of the 13th century, so roughly at this time, is likely later compared to the knight we are discussing here, makes plate armor appearing. And plate armor was practically designed for that, not just against crossbows, but against any weapon. But chiefly crossbow seems to have had a major impact in the whole process. So what you could do with this hammer was definitely striking against a coat of mail and breaking it, and causing consisting damage underneath it to the guy who was wearing it. With the backside, which is point instead, you could do other things, including, using it against an armored opponent, or maybe using that to give I don't know how to say that, a grace struck to finish off an enemy, maybe piercing through the face. Look at this guy that more of that of head protection later, because this guy here is probably represented with naked face, but he probably would have worn a helm into fights. But if you wanted to kill someone easily, just take his helm off if he's laying down, wounded or something else, and just strike with either side of the mace, of the martel, to say it the French way. This is actually a sometimes I was reflecting really on the use of that this weapon could have. I personally think I've seen countless times. I was just thinking about the XIII today that had certain things, that this kind of hammers or axes were quite useful in cavalry warfare, especially when you had to pass striking people that are on foot from the giving this very strong blow from up to down and downwards, and or just passing, with a galloping or however running horse, and giving these hits with the mace. But definitely a martel de fer could be practically used also by infantries. Although especially by the 14th century, it seems that these weapons were increasingly evolving towards a long-handled variety, which means that they were getting spread among troops that wanted to grow increasingly distant from the enemy when using them. This is a pretty short type of martel de fer for an infantryman, for what we know, but in absolute terms, it doesn't matter what you have in your hands as long as you want to kill your opponent. So we don't have to be dogmatic or too mechanicistic in saying this weapon was only used on horseback, or preferably, and the one of the infantry were used in a different fashion. Also because very often the 13th century knights could as well dismount. It is true that the 13th century is the century into which cavalry has feudal cavalry basically arises prominently and basically unopposed on the European battlefields. But definitely that's a good cavalry charge is something you can have in a pitched battle, but most of warfare would have happened in skirmishes and stuff, sieges, stuff like that. And this looks actually pretty elite fighter, in the sense that the knight equipped in this fashion was something very costly to equip. So usually these troops weren't really thrown out into the meat grinder just to do skirmishing or scouting, or to be thrown senselessly into urban contexts of like traps, like cities with narrow streets with crossbow bolts arriving from everywhere. But it was definitely a fighter that could, however, find himself into one of those situations, and therefore fighting both on horseback and on foot. If your horse gets struck, as it often happened, and you're on foot, you are left on your own. Plus, let's always consider that the guy is wearing a sword. So technically speaking, here we are seeing something that was the norm at the time in terms of equipment, because it would have been pretty strange for a medieval knight of the time not to have a secondary weapon with him. Here we're talking obviously about an artistical representation that can be, can have poetic licenses, and we will more of that later, in the sense that it's all pretty accurate actually, but the point is, what does this martel de fer with a buckler have to do? Which is probably the most important thing that we have to try to explain. But it would have been normal for a knight here having a sword and a secondary weapon that was usually a mace, an axe, that in this sense is pretty useful because it can break through armor, while the sword, unless it doesn't give a very heavy blow, it can do a very few damage in practice to the. Also, the sword has a blunt effect, but in order to break mail, it took an astonishing force, and usually just with a double-hand axe you could achieve something like that, breaking mail in practice. Although, here artistical licenses definitely show us knights passing through armored opponents as if they were, knife and butter, but that's a kind of exaggeration, just like today we have stupid special effects in movies that are absolutely unrealistic, even at the time when they used to decorate manuscripts. They wanted to over-exaggerate sometimes to make it more spectacular, but just for saying that having a secondary weapon like a martel de fer was something pretty normal at this point. Maybe not extremely here for being actually a secondary weapon. It's a bit big in my opinion. It could easily be worn hanging at the belt, but no, I don't think so. It's actually good, average dimension even for a secondary weapon. But the primary weapon definitely seems to have been the sword, which was much more effective. You can fight at a longer distance from the enemy. You can, and it's very interesting in this sense when you find maces, into a warfare context. Not only that shows that there is armor around, but it also shows that the guy who's using it is probably an armored guy, like just in this case. Because if you want to get close to an enemy with such a short weapon like an axe, a mace, a hammer, you need protection. You need to have enough protection to get close to an enemy that can strike blows at you as well. That's the reason why pole arms were something more spread into the unarmored troops, because the unarmored troop wouldn't engage into hand-to-hand into melee proper, but just to rely on the compactness of the formation that when was broken couldn't really do much. These 13th century knights were instead kind of of brilliant collective fighters, but also as much as brilliant individual fighters. So this guy was conceived even for fighting alone against another knight, which could happen, by the way, because as we were saying, into the mess of a charge, you could fold, you could find yourself into a pretty messy situation and engage an enemy in that fashion. Now what is mostly interesting and kind of complicates the picture here, as we were saying, is the buckler. First of all, it's a relatively small buckler, as we were saying. If you look at especially Iberian sources of this time, you see that the Christian knights were essentially the same of everywhere else, but they retained a kind of local tradition based on the jinetes, on the highly intense guerrilla warfare on horseback that took place into the Iberian frontier with the Muslims, and those guys privileged round shields compared to the kite ones that were definitely spread also there, but kind of more proper of the original Frankish tradition that eventually was exported through Normandy into England and to France and the Normans a bit everywhere where feudalism spread. And the bucklers you find there are actually pretty large. They're round shields that are lighter than the kite ones. They're probably also made of lighter material. Here it's a pretty small one. And the question is, what kind of reason there would have been in a context into which, normally the kite shield was spread, and of using such a small shield. Actually, the kite-shaped shield is something that at this time is growing increasingly smaller, because usually it was something very big. If you take the 11th century, the average Norman knight, you see that his kite shields were quite enveloping, quite protected, quite tall. At this time, progressively, and especially eventually when plate armor began to appear in the mid of the century, the shield the kite shield, it was a pretty heavy thing in relative terms, begins to get smaller, and to be unnecessary in practice. If you arrive to 15th century Europe, basically the knight doesn't have a shield anymore, usually, because he's so heavily armored that the armor was more effective than the shield in practice. At this time, the kite shield was still the average, and it was a still relatively large kite shield, not so big I mean, there is a really progressive shrinking, but such a small buckler is not an answer. I mean, the average would have still been different at this time. So the question that scholars said, what was this guy fighting like? What are the options at this point that in which kind of fencing, of warfare are a martel de fer and a small buckler paired to be effective in which fighting environment? Well, there are actually some hints. We don't have an answer, and this is just to get acquainted with the majority of problems that we have in discussing warfare at such a distant time from our own. First of all, we know sometimes that these bucklers were used in combination with falchions, which is, the falchion being essentially a sword with a very large top that is meant to essentially to chop, because it's not at all anything particularly effective against armor in itself. It's mostly a weapon that was used against unarmored troops, and it is and there is this prejudice that the falchion was used in this sense by essentially the peasantry, or at least lightly armored troops like the commoners and stuff like that. But as a matter of fact, it is not true. First of all, we have a lot of depictions of knights using falchions. Secondly, if you think about it, this is a point that even Matt Easton did in one of his videos on Schola Gladiatoria with his falchion. It would have been for someone armed. It's a point that I was making also before. If you are a heavily armored fighter, like a knight, and you're fighting against a mass of rebelling commoners or peasants that are on average pretty badly armored at this time, why not get into them heavily armored, so well protected, maybe with a kite shield to parry the heavier blows maybe of pole arms, but just chopping into the midst of them with a falchion, it's gonna be pretty effective. And I don't know actually of the representations of buckler used in conjunction with falchion, but I believe it's something pretty likely actually to have happened, especially in an unarmored context, especially when in guerrilla actions, ambushes, when even in robberies organized, think about brigandage and all. I mean, having a weapon that can chop, and then a light a shield that is lighter and therefore allows you to be more mobile than a kite one is kind of an effective pairing. But what's the point indeed with a martel de fer? I mean, we have said the martel de fer is the exact opposite. it's a weapon that is mostly fit for fighting against armored opponents. So when you fight against an armored opponent, maybe you need even an increased protection in terms of shield. You're not gonna fence off the weapons of an armored opponent that might be using a hammer as well to parry his blows. You need something more resistance, like a solid wooden kite shield. So the point is, probably this has not much to do with that. It is, however, known that at the time sword and buckler fencing was a popular upper-class pursuit, especially at the end of the 13th century. I don't know if it is this notion is specifically referred to England, because I'm reading this from Armies of Feudal Europe, page 78. I don't know, but yeah, it kind of makes sense. I mean, the elite. Here it says the popular upper classes, yeah, definitely there were, but probably this happened even among nobles, the nobility. I mean, we don't have to think that the nobles, even when they were training on their own and making tournaments or duels of some sort, were always armored, or that they were skilled just to fight in that fashion. Definitely that would have been their prevalent way of fighting, but even proving to be skilled enough with, sword and buckler might have been something interesting to do. Also because that, when you're very heavily armored, you can definitely move decently into, and make pretty amazing feats as an individual fighter, both in physical and in technical terms. But you're also very heavily loaded, and you don't have that full mobility that maybe a feint fight with fake weapons and all can be achieved. So I'm not sure that whether there are sources or not, but I'm pretty positive to think that even nobles trained themselves with, I don't know, sticks and bucklers fighting, and we see that, however, it was definitely a type of fencing that was popular and spread enough into the popular classes that, were still pretty much in contact with the nobles in some fashion. So since the nobles really mastered this time every kind of military art, including the one of using crossbows and all these things that were trying to conceal for ideological reasons, and because there are all ideals behind chivalry that to which reality was very, very different. They could have been perfectly skilled at this type of fencing too. But this doesn't still explain what the hell was a hammer, a war hammer paired with a buckler in practice, because if you're just by the way, using a falchion would have been significantly even safe to use against armor, even in a simulation, but even though it's still dangerous in some part, but normally the I think that these trainings were done with other kind of weapons, although tournaments were saw the use of actually every time of deadly weapon that was used in small, because actually killing someone who is covered in iron, unless you don't have a crossbow, as we were saying, or something like that, it's actually pretty difficult. You can make a lot of harm. We know that tournaments left a lot of people with broken bones and even some deads often. But I don't know. When you talk about the Warhammer, you're basically thinking about really breaking up that armor. So which kind of training of extra of simulation you're trying to achieve there in practice. You're also ruining the armor, by the way, which was not something that you could ruin so easily. So this weapon suggests that whichever fencing this thing was tried to do was aimed at breaking armor for a real reason and in real ways. So there are essentially, here I'm quoting Nicole relatively to this this problem of this weird, or at least unusual pair that are actually pretty interesting. There's a first hypothesis that takes into consideration the geographical setting of this, Worcestershire being quite close to Wales. Nicole suggests that this lighter shield especially could indicate the influence of light infantry tactics close to the Welsh border, or even into the Welsh border, into which the English were popping out somewhere sometimes. And when I read it at the beginning, I said, kind of doesn't convince me, because I don't like very much, first of all, these generalizations nor mechanicism, but then thinking about it, it might have not been so strange after all, because theoretically speaking, I don't know if you know Welsh warfare, what it was about at the time, but substantially the British, the English especially, like to stress that into this period of Middle Ages, as there was the Baltic frontier, the Near Eastern frontier, the Iberian frontier, there was also the so-called Celtic frontier, so what they call the Celtic or Celtic fringe in the British Islands. So Wales, Ireland, Scotland, into which the English were substantially expanding as a feudal force that was fighting, in fact, as a with the average kind of warfare that existed throughout the lower feudal Europe. And since the Celtic fringe was not heavily feudalized yet, actually some parts remaining pretty stranger to feudalism up to recently late in time, relatively late in time. There was another type of warfare, and the Wales, especially being mountainous and forested, and having this still, I can't say tribal society, but still clanic in many ways, and fighting with ambushes, skirmishes, and guerrilla warfare in general, privileged lighter equipment that is needed for moving on difficult terrain, for making quick assaults, harassing the enemy, and achieving greater mobility in practice. So we know, as a matter of fact, that since very early in time, even at the time of the Anglo-Saxons, think about, I don't know, Harold of Godwinson, and when he campaigned against the Welsh, he was fitted to fight in the traditional Anglo-Saxon warfare, even as a Norman knight. And when he fought into Wales, he adapted to Welsh tactics, so already at the time. So it seems that the Norman English, if we can call them this way, the Anglo-Normans, it's a better term, kept when keeping to fight against Welsh, kind of adapted in practice to this lighter way of fighting in some way on a difficult terrain and all. So basically, this hypothesis is concentrating the attention on the light shield by saying, okay, the martel de fer was kind of a standard weapon at this point, especially if paired with the long sword. But this buckler exists, and it is also small to make the guy lighter. Yes, it is possible, but it is possible at this point even if this guy wasn't fighting into Wales. I mean, if we're taking in general all the possibilities, we know that being a knight had definitely certain standards at this point. Being a feudal lord and having a certain type of equipment here, the mail, for instance, that the armor that is wearing is perfectly similar to the one of any other knight at the time. There's nothing unusual in that. It's just the weaponry. And I don't know, if a guy wanted to use a small buckler for some reason that we cannot know, that maybe he was keen on that, he loved that, he has this customized preference or whatever, he might have used that point, and maybe even to make it sculpted on his gravestone, like in this case. And it is definitely possible in general. I mean, that this could have happened in Wales for that reason, but maybe somewhere else for similar reasons, or just for being lighter. When you are on horseback, I think that carrying those kite shields is something pretty difficult to do, in the sense that the shield has weight, and in general you would like to be lighter in that sense. Maybe the Welsh environment, warfare brought it to be more necessary. But by the way, the Welsh were famous in this sense for throwing a lot of darts at the more heavily armored Englishmen, even with some success. Arrows, javelins, stuff like that. So maybe the smaller shield in this sense is it's going against this logics. Maybe a kite-shaped shield would have been more effective against that kind of warfare. So it's like 50-50 in practice. It's really about how how you prefer that personally, and we can't really trace that, unfortunately. So this Welsh hypothesis, calling it this way, is a bit yeah, I kind of thought about that, but it's really it remains a full speculation in practice. The second hypothesis, that instead I find extremely more interesting and it kind of makes sense in practice, is that this man. By the way, we have no idea what this guy is. I mean, in many the gravestones preserved into churches at this time are some our most iconographic, our best iconographic resource in practice, because these are normally full-size statues, because they are meant to be put on the grave plate of the buried guy. So they're extremely detailed, they're multidimensional, they are pretty helpful at understanding what a knight at that time really was. And we usually know who this guy was, if not by the name written, sculpted on the grave, maybe on the considering that that chapel was property of someone, or just by the heraldry on the coat of arms and all. In this case, we don't know who this guy is really, and therefore we can't know eventually even about who he was and what he did in practice. But the other hypothesis that's been suggested is that this guy could have been a professional champion. As this weaponry would have been normally associated with trial by combat. Now, judicial combat, and this is a beautiful theory that kind of makes more sense. Why? It also doesn't solve the problem, because it's not a proof of anything at this point, but judicial duels were quite spread at the time. There was an inherent fight into Europe between Roman law and the local, usually Germanic laws, like the common law in England, which were starting from completely different points of view. Like the Roman law said that basically the state had to be in charge of of the army, and nobody could, and it would tend to minimize the use of weaponry among the population to keep them, you know, away from rebellions, not to create problems and all. Germanic societies that didn't have that kind of centralized state had produced instead something very different. They said, since we don't have a centralized state, but basically we have to carry out on our own as clans, as tribes, we have the right to bear arms. And among the various things, since there is not one guy at the top who can impose his own judgment on us as freemen, we're gonna solve our matters, with a duel, with a trial. That, in this sense, this was originally a pagan tradition, so obviously the gods would intervene. Eventually, even with the Christianization, this said, okay, it's still God that is choosing. And what is interesting is that in England this was already forbidden, because the most civilized, centralized states at the time were trying to get rid of this judicial trials, because they were obviously unfair. But England, being a country of relatively strong Germanic tradition, was keeping that alive, and that is not something you can erase. Like, not even the Norman Kingdom of England, so well centralized as it was, and so well advanced in administrative structures and all, could impose to the peasantry, to the subjects, such rules. This is, by the way, a time to which the English monarchy has suffered a very heavy blow from the defeat of Bouvines with the Magna Carta and all, the increasing prerogatives of the barons that obviously conceived this means, especially their right of bearing arms and being free in their usage, was something that he couldn't contrast pretty much. But I mean, this was present basically in all the rest of Europe at the time. There weren't so strong states that could disarm the populations or to practically eliminate judicial duels. But the population would continue to do that, in fact, and therefore we know that it was spread custom to do so. Now the point is, what does a judicial duel actually mean? It doesn't mean that the two people who were arguing with each other, the two sides, are really fighting. Normally, some guys would be hired to carry out the job. And we know, by the way, that these were quite bloody affairs. I don't know about England, specifically about certain cases. I know about Scotland that still at the end of the 14th century were some extremely bloody judicial duels going on, with a mortality rate that was way higher than the one of a normal the one of a normal battle at the time. So these are also very meaningful and interesting fencing situations that took place, and kind of combats that were different from battles in practice, but being carried out very violently. So, giving the hypothesis, this Martel de Fer suggests that it could have been definitely used in this fashion. Why the buckler, you say? Well, the idea is that as long as the state could not impose the disarming of the population would still, society in general, had still sort of control onto these things. I mean, why were judicial duels actually carried out? They were carried out because they functioned for that society. So it's not that these guys would arrive there with no regulations because they were, I don't know, uh, those in charge. I mean, there was really a society that wanted to make it fair at the point of regulating maybe the equipment. There were actually lots of various, we know even from Germanic laws that I remember with the Longbirds that there were lots of prescriptions that the judicial duel had to be fair, in the sense that the duelists didn't have to have assumed like drugs and stuff like that. I mean, it was something pretty detailed and something that was actively carried out and perceived as a serious thing that had to be regulated. So this small buckler might have existed in the sense for kind of speeding up the duel in some fashion. Because I don't know, maybe this is just speculation, but the idea is that first of all, this is a duel, and the duel implies that you're not fighting in a formation. Although we must say that these duels could see even multiple, actually not just single duelists, but bands of people. But usually it was a duel, at least in the more, I believe, especially in the most civilized places. Sometimes the bloodiest affairs with hired bands that had to clash against each other happened in more wild, let's say in wilder environments. I think that in this sense England was a bit different from Scotland, but now I'm just speculating. But well, I can't say forget about this because I still think it makes sense. But there could be multiple people fighting from one side. But we think that the average was the 1 versus 1. And in the 1 versus 1, what you need is agility, because you're not fighting with your shoulders covered by someone else, or fighting shoulder to shoulder with someone else, and therefore presenting this large shield in front just to defend yourself. You're there to win as a single, because the individual who wins represents a side, and everybody has to be sure that the guy has won. So maybe a bigger shield would have been seen maybe just as a postponing of the outcome of the trial. It might have generated debates in the sense that maybe if the shield broke or it was built up in a certain fashion that maybe was overpowered in order to make, then this created problems for the regulation. A small buckler instead is something that can fairly content everyone. As we have seen, the buckler was small bucklers were used also among the popular classes in fighting, so it was a pretty spread type of shield that could be recognized easily, that didn't was also a popular weapon. And this is important because maybe you have to think that these duels with such a heavily armored guy might have been carried out by commoners communities that hired professionals like knights that maybe adapted to this jobs in times of peace because it was profitable to do so. At the point of even being identified at the end of their lives on their gravestones as duelist champions, in this sense. So this is a kind of an option, and the option is also that implies that if you're fighting 1 versus 1, there is pretty much a lot of mobility, because you're basically on your own. You have to be able to move, to go back and forth, and all these things. So a smaller shield is something that kind of allows you to do more things in terms of mobility, and to, in this sense, become more dangerous to the enemy, which in a juridical sense it kind of is perfectly fitting, because what you want here is not two guys really slamming on their kite shields like boom, boom, for a prolonged time. All you want is that it's been solved quickly and without any doubt. In practice, the duel would finish actually with the last man standing, but in practice we think that this happened by one of the opponents saying, okay, I give up, I'm won, I'm craven, um, which put an end to. I mean, he admitted his defeat. It admitted his defeat, and the so the small shield kind of makes sense. And if the other guy was armored, definitely a hammer in this sense was speeding up the outcome of the duel, because it is not a sword, it's not a falchion, it is a weapon that is particularly designed exactly to break against armor. So to do an effect that is particularly aimed of taking out an armored opponent without doubt. If these guys had fought into a duel with a falchion, they would have just destroyed the falchion and the mail would have remained intact, so how could they win over each other? So I think that this option is really, it kind of really makes sense. However, another point that I want to make is, now you don't have to go out there and say, oh, Schwerpunkt said this and so it is. No, because actually this guy could have been simply a guy fighting in a battle with this kind of equipment that might be unusual, it might be weird, but it's still a decent equipment. It's still something you can do a good amount of things in a pitched battle, in a siege, in many situations. Maybe it's irrational. People are irrational because maybe there are better solutions, but this guy, I don't know, for some reason he wanted to be represented like this. So he had been wanted to be depicted like this. And that's all we know. So this guy could have been a duelist. Yes, and he might have chosen to be represented like this with these weapons for this very reason. But he might have simply been a normal knight that fought in this fashion. And the fact that, however, this shield is represented here doesn't mean that he would actually go into battle with this shield. It was much more. Everything was much more interchangeable than we usually think, and we don't have to be amazed by a guy at the time using this kind of weapon for no reason. Another thing that I wanted to tell that is secondary but still interesting is really about the mail. It's like a bit of custom. If you look at the top of his head, you see that basically this guy was wearing a helm. I mean, the helm was the average and most important. Head protection is the first thing. A reason for which this guy is wearing a coat of mail around the head, with all the the padded coat beneath, and he would have worn a helm. You just don't see here it because he wanted to show his face in practice. But the top of the head tells you usually what kind of a helm he was wearing. At this time, the elms were evolving from a flat-topped helms to something more, something I don't know, more curved, like the great helm that would have developed afterwards. The reason here you see his head so shaped is actually that so squarely shaped is that he might be wearing an arming cap underneath the mail. Here the coif was essentially a separate piece from the rest of the mail, and underneath you had this cap, and which by the way allowed also to stabilize the helm over his head, and to make it fit better, and even to, in this sense, absorb more strengths of eventual hits around the arming cap and not the skull, because that's not something you want to do. You want to suffer. And we have other examples of this, like the one of the effigy of William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury, that is dated to 1226 in the the Salisbury Cathedral. And yeah, that's pretty much. And it's actually beautiful effigy, in my opinion. Kind of, the guy looks kind of sympathetic. And definitely we have this uncommon pairing of the warhammer and the small buckler. And it, we mentioned the reasons why this could be. They kind of make sense. Then you see this surcoat that he's wearing. We can see his sword, but yeah, for the rest, aside his hammer and buckler, he's typical average knight of the first half of the 13th century from England, as well from the rest of Europe, because basically the equipment was equal for every knight, with just maybe minor differences. By the way, this is practically the time from which eventually armor begins to grow heavier. There are several layers of mail that eventually started to appear, then plate armor, and all for the increasing needs of protection deriving from the widespread the spread of crossbows, but not only, also of dangerous commoners' infantry that could pierce you with their pole arms and all. So this guy is kind of the last generation before that. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed my video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel for receiving news about my new contents. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.